Windy with wind gusts over 50 miles per hour. Thursday, mostly sunny and 44. Friday, mostly sunny and 45. Next Saturday, rain is likely, mostly cloudy, high of 50. Breezy with winds gusting to 35 miles per hour. Chance of rain on Saturday, 70%.
WOON Woonsocket Radio, ON AM and FM.
Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
What is a changeling? Are there really supernatural things we should be afraid of in the night? Who or what is kidnapping the children? Well, hello and welcome to the 1029th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON AM and FM radio here in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal radio app from TalkStream Live, on YouTube. I'm Ben, and with me today is Tim Schwartz.
Can't hear you, Ben.
Oh, that's probably why you can't hear me. I had me on Program 1, not Program 2. Oh boy, it comes full circle, doesn't it? Well, I just gave the intro, and I started doing Tim's intro because I was like, oh, Tim must not be able to hear me, and then I didn't look at the board, and here we are. You know what? It's funny how full circle it comes. So Tim Schwartz was supposed to be doing this, and he's here with us as well to help things along, and Paul is with us via Skype.
Hello.
Say hello there, Tim.
Oh, well, hi, Paul, Ben, and Joshua. Happy to be here with you all today.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and sorry about that little goof there. You probably saw my mouth moving, and we're terrified, and you know what? We're all in the same boat. So, with us today, prolific author and co-author of many books, Joshua Cutchin, has appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs, discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM and Mysterious Universe. Joshua has been featured on the hit History Channel show Ancient Aliens, and is a recurring roundtable guest on the Where Did the Road Go podcast. He speaks at many paranormal conferences. One of his recent works is Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abductions, the subject of today's show. And Joshua's website, Joshua Cutchin, that's CUTCHIN.com.
Joshua Cutchin, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
It's so nice to be here, and quite an honor to be here today. So I really do appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to where the conversation takes us.
Oh, yes, and boy, oh boy, we're going to start off with a bang, as we typically do. So, tell us what a changeling is, and is there any evidence that the phenomenon exists?
Oh boy, how long is the program?
Long enough.
So the simplest version of a changeling would be a human, the imposter that is left behind when a human infant is taken by something else. And I am deliberately that vague because you will find allusions to changelings in the folklore of certain spirits. You'll find allusions to them even in some wild man legends, and even, I believe, among some Native American tribes, including some lake monster legends as well. But where we typically know changelings from in our modern pop culture is from the fairy folklore, predominantly of Western Europe, although, again, it is really a worldwide global phenomenon. Now, as to exactly what this imposter left behind was, and the reasons behind it, that requires a little bit more explanation. Generally speaking, changelings that you would find in places like Ireland and the UK would have been left behind by the fairies, and they would have fallen into one of three categories. They would have been a sickly fairy infant, they would have been an elderly fairy, or they would have been what was known as a stock or a fetch, which oftentimes was sort of a wooden effigy that was cloaked with fairy magic or fairy glamour to appear like an animated child. The reasons behind this do vary. There are some very interesting connections that you can find that seem to speak to the way that our modern UFO phenomenon reflects older fairy folklore, by which I mean one of the reasons that fairies would take human infants would be because their own race was sort of dwindling and a dying race, and sometimes it was felt that from time to time the race would need a shot in the arm, so to speak, a new infusion of vigor and good genes from the human population. So that's one reason. Although if you had an elderly fairy involved in this transaction, sometimes it was almost like a hospice arrangement for the elderly fairy to live out its remaining days among human beings. Oftentimes, if it was an infant fairy that was the actual changeling, it would be brought there because fairy milk was deemed to be a sham. It had no substance to it, whereas human milk was deemed to actually be nutritious. But in these narratives, almost every single one of them ends the same way, which is the parent of the taken child begins to suspect that something is wrong with their infant. And eventually they, through a series of methods, reveal that the child is not a human child, and then they seek some sort of way to rectify the situation through the advice of a seer, cunning man, cunning woman, fairy doctor, a folk medicine figure. Now, do these stories have any basis in reality? That's a thornier and more complex question. A lot of modern medical scholars have seen hallmarks of some of these older changeling stories and have claimed that they represent a variety of diseases that we now recognize, both diseases and developmental disabilities. Things like progeria, other medical conditions that we now recognize as being, not supernatural, have been blamed for the rise of these changeling narratives. Similarly, some people in the medical community believe that these were early attempts of these communities to deal with autism. There is a darker side to some of these stories because in a lot of these changeling narratives, the changeling is cast out or sometimes even, quite frankly, tortured to the point of death. And in places like Ireland, this was prior to the 19th century, a means by which to enact infanticide without having to deal with the repercussions if you had a child that was deemed more of a burden than a help. And the infanticide rates in rural Ireland were absolutely shocking. There's a book that I talk about by a scholar named Elaine Farrell, who took a look at infanticide in Ireland between 1850 and 1900. And she was just looking at children less than 3 years old. And in that 50-year period, she found about 4,600 cases of infanticide. And remember, this is not an enormous country either. So it was a common problem amongst the community, and there were a lot of different socioeconomic factors and reasons for that. But you have to, whenever you talk about changelings, I think it's really important to sort of preface all this with the fact that these stories do have a darker real-world set of implications. Having said that, there are stories that you will find where these changelings, one of the very common ways to sort of out the changeling as being of the fairy world, not of the human world, would be to entice it to speak and in some sort of manner, and usually intimate the fact that it was older than the oak. That a lot of times I'd say I saw the acorn before the oak, but I've never seen XYZ. So some people have countered and pushed back against the explanation of the changeling narrative being a means of dealing with developmental disabilities, and have said, well, these in these stories, if we were to take some of them at face value, it appears as if the infant changeling actually talks, and that's not something that you'd expect from a mythologized version to sort of account for some of these developmental disabilities. So all those caveats aside, I tend to view the topic of changelings as more of a metaphysical switch than a physical one. I think that it probably looks something a bit more like you would see along the lines of soul theft in certain shamanic and indigenous societies. But it's one of those motifs that has never really left us, and you find it in pop culture all the time. And there's an entire body of work dedicated to just studying how this motif has expressed itself both across time and space.
That is okay. Well, now we can go in many directions, and that I think before we go down a weird rabbit hole where there's probably no answers, which is a majority of the paths I would suppose. I guess the word changeling is kind of a very less nuanced idea. You know, it kind of encompasses a lot of different things. It's like a framework almost. I guess you can kind of look at stuff. Because you brought up the idea of alien abductions kind of being lumped in there, and like anything if you want to throw in like skinwalkers or anything like that. The sort of concept, kind of rounding out the early portion of our definition there, it is present in a lot of different cultures, whether it's just this idea of someone having essentially invasion of the body snatched, or perhaps even used as an excuse for doing horrible unspeakable things, or something to kind of explain the unexplainable at the time, right? I guess first things first, how can we differentiate the types of changelings? Instead of just saying, okay, well, it's just fairies, or it's just this or just that. There's, I guess, or maybe you can't differentiate. Maybe it's one of those things where it's so unnuanced and so malleable. You can form it into many different molds. Do you follow what I'm saying?
I do, and there is an additional sort of wrinkle in the fact that fairy folklore tends to be among the most malleable sets of belief that you'll find, to the extent that some people today that I've met will identify as changelings and say that I was a fairy child who was swapped out, and that's not quite what these stories were describing. And again, I tend to view a lot of these things on more of a spiritual or less materialistic level than a lot of these older stories would suggest. But yeah, it does sort of nest into this broader umbrella of shape-shifting and things not being as they seem. The means by which you would sort of discover that you had a changeling in your midst would be that the child would constantly eat and never put on any weight. It would just be ill-tempered. In a lot of these stories, and I'm sure, again, this is sort of a fictional embellishment, sometimes you would spy on the child and see the fairy child playing the bagpipes and dancing around the rafters of the house while you're not there. And then you'd be like, oh, you're something different. But the other method, which I sort of alluded to was that you would do something nonsensical, and this would sort of coax the changeling to have to announce the fact that it didn't know what you were doing. What I mean by that is that a common motif was this sort of, it's called a brewery of eggshells, which would be that you would make something in some sort of unconventional container. So sometimes you'd be brewing beer in eggshells. Sometimes you'd be making porridge in shellfish, shells, something like that. It was all very culture dependent. There are some cultures, I believe, in amongst, I think it's amongst indigenous Finns, where they would construct a spoon so long that it would, you connect a bunch of spoons together and it would be a spoon so long that it would have to reach up the chimney. But the idea was to get the changeling to see something that they had never seen before, and that's where you get this sort of rhyme that you see different variations on it, but it's something along the lines of the acorn before the oak I knew, but never beer in eggshell brew. And this is the idea of saying, hey, I'm old and I've never seen this, and I just had to speak up about it. But it is tied now to nowadays. If you do view the fairy folklore as a continuum that has evolved into the sort of alien abduction mythos, which if you have another 2 hours, I can make a very strong case for that myself. But looking at the work of folks like Jacques Vallée and myself, who've just really dug into this, I see antecedents in modern UFO contact with pretty much anything that you'll find in the fairy folklore. And if you look at it that way, then this constant refrain that we hear from the UFO community of, the hybridization program, or even things like indigo children or star children, really do seem to be a variation on this thing. Although I will say that in the case of indigo children and star children, they are sort of these changed out imposters with something else, but they tend to be more positive,
But they're not trying to steal your life. They're just trying to make the world a better place.
but that's something that took me a while to get my head around, is the fact that even when something looks like the exact opposite, sometimes it's an expression of the same motif from a folklore perspective. What I mean by that is that, you know, the changelings are these substitutes that are horrible to be around, because, you know, every one of these stories says that living with a changeling is just the most stressful thing ever. Whereas these indigo children and star children are wonderful to have around. I'm like, well, how are these things related if they're the polar opposites? But then I read a passage from Patrick Harpur's Daemonic Reality, which is an excellent book. And he makes a reference to the fact that in these older fairy legends, the fairies are always going, 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 but never gone. You see these numerous allusions dating back to Chaucer about the exodus of the fairies who are being driven out by scientism or materialism or the Industrial Revolution or whatever. The fairies are always going, 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 but never gone. And according to the ufologists, the aliens are always coming, 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 but never here. And then that was when I was like, okay, so it seems as if, you know, these motifs can change to the exact opposite and still sort of retain the similar sentiment behind them. So yeah, I would definitely put all these in the same spectrum. Is that kind of an answer to your question?
Yeah, no, it definitely it doesn't sound like it is, but it is, because you use the magic word, which is mythos, and that's very important, because we're all participating in this story, right? You know, we use the word mythology not as, you know, this is a goofy little thing that we're using to explain lightning and weather, where it's a story in which we participate. And in this case, you know, I have this idea. Well, it's not an idea. This is kind of a fact. We're at a tremendous disadvantage because we're in the year 2024 now, and most of these stories were written, you know, hundreds of, if not thousands of years ago. And these ideas have been passed along for so long that we are now in this postmodern society. And, you know, what do we do with all of this, right? We've thrown out everything. We have no context for anything. So, of course, you'll have people walking up to you saying, oh, yeah, well, I'm a fairy. And it's like, okay, cool.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah.
Why not? You know, it's you know, it could be possible, but, you know, the idea, the context of it, right? You know, this was considered a bad thing. You know, it's like California
Right.
Buddhism. You know, my very short stint where I spent some time at the Providence Zen Center, they referred to, you know, the sort of like pop Buddhism as California Buddhism, where it's like it's not really real. It's just kind of like a marketed version of it. You know, you're not getting the real thing. It's seen as this
Yeah.
mystical thing.
With all the difficult parts filed off to accommodate your 21st century needs. Yeah.
Exactly. You know what I mean. But it's the same.
Yeah,
it's
no,
the same deal. You know, and I agree.
Yeah. No, I totally know what you mean, and I think that oh my goodness. I mean, this is sort of getting into something that we could talk about as well, but I'm definitely of the opinion that if you look at a lot of these topics, but especially something like the UFO topic, which I believe is related to the fairy topic, we labor too hard towards proving these things in this binary of true or false, and, you know, physical or psychic. And one of my favorite summations of this of how unsustainable this idea was put forth by Terence McKenna on an old episode of Thinking Aloud, where he said, you know, just because the UFO is a psychic object does not mean that it's not a physical object. And he goes on to explain how, you know, along this sort of Jungian line of thinking, that we don't have the intellectual tools to explore that barrier where things can sometimes be psychic and sometimes be physical. But if you look at a lot of the paranormal, there is a suggestion that these things do inhabit that space. I mean, psi phenomena is both internal, but also can affect consensus reality, and ghosts seem to not be really of that much substance, but can interact with our physical environment and leave behind footprints and talcum powder and slam doors. So I think that we have to really sort of revisit this sort of dichotomy that we have between the real and the not real, or the psychic and the physical, or quite frankly, between reality and fiction. I think that boundary is a little bit more porous than we would suspect. So when I have people come to me and say, you know, I'm a fairy, I was displaced from my fairy home sometime in my youth, I treat them in obviously I treat everyone that I meet with respect, but I treat their scenario in my head similar to the way that I treat people who come to me and say that they believe that they're, half Zeta Reticulum, that they were a baby that was a product of this hybridization program. I think that there's a truth there, but I think that it's more of a metaphorical truth than it is a literal truth, and I think that it might have something to do with existing on this sort of spiritual level. And if you look at a lot of these these changeling stories, the reason that I've sort of come around to viewing them as sort of something more along the lines of soul theft is that in most of the stories that you see of these changeling children, when they are switched back, so the idea, I'm getting ahead of myself, the idea was to basically torture the changeling until the fairy folk would see how poorly you were treating one of their own kind and re-swap the two, giving you back your human child. And of course, obviously, as we've alluded to, this led to some incredible tragedies. But what I find interesting about reading those stories is that oftentimes you aren't necessarily present when the swap takes place. So in rural Ireland, you'll find allusions to not only leaving them at places of power like crossroads or open graves, but also outside on the dung heap. And then you hear a great whirlwind and you go back outside, and it's no longer a changeling, it's your own human infant. There was one instance that I found in Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by Walter Evans Wentz, where there was a child who was a changeling and awoke after being swapped out, but there was no physical swap out. The child just sort of awoke as if they were coming out of a coma or a trance. So I do suspect that something's happening here at more of a metaphysical level, which would definitely be in tandem with some of these changeling stories that you would see that afflicted adults, because segments of the population that were deemed vulnerable, not only children but also women, would also be switched out for these changelings as well. And in many of these cases, these people wasted away and died, but the idea held within the community was that the person who was buried wasn't the actual person, it was the changeling that was buried. But another way of looking at that is that there was some sort of illness or trauma that led to a loosening of the bonds between body and soul, and the person really was, in that sense, away with the fairies, but the thing that you buried was their physical self. And that's sort of where I've come around to. A lot of the rural Irish folklore would strongly disagree with that assessment. They felt that it was a physical swap. But if you look at the fact that many cultures believe that our souls can wander in times of distress or trauma or illness, and the fact that the near-death literature seems to suggest that as well, including these near-death experiences where no trauma is present, then I would think that what we're actually seeing in the cases of some of these changelings is someone basically being deprived or switched out of their soul, or something along the lines of a walk-in or a possession or something.
It is a universal human fear, isn't it? That not only can our children or loved ones be snatched away from us the moment that our back is turned from them, but that they could also be taken from us by a supernatural type of element. I mean, it's one thing that, the bear can come into your cabin and, eat your children, but what can you do about something that's paranormal that can do whatever it wants, and we're powerless against it?
No, right. I mean, you can prepare against even things. I mean, obviously you can prepare against a bear attack, with firearms and weapons and making sure that your door is bolted. But you can also prepare to a certain degree against things like illness with, healthy practices and clean running water. But if there's this supernatural element, then it supersedes all precautions. And that's why you have this development of these superstitions that you'd find. And the list of superstitions to prevent changelings is just about as long as the list of changeling stories themselves. But yeah, it does speak to this primal fear and this sort of powerlessness that a lot of us feel, and I think is heightened, when you're a new parent, especially. And a lot of these narratives take place with exceedingly young children. The idea was that up until the point of baptism is when these infants were most vulnerable to being swapped out for changelings, which speaks to the fact that they were in this liminal zone, right, between birth and being born into the church. The sort of in between zone was when they were most at risk. So yeah.
It does bring up an interesting point, because not only do we have this idea of fairy stories and these changeling ideas kind of woven into history, it's like it is indeed sort of almost ingrained in us in a sense, and it's expressed in a lot of different ways. And I'm reminded a lot of philosopher Charles Taylor, who talks a lot about the sort of two ideas of the self in human history. So you have, the pre-modern idea of the self with the porous self, where sort of the boundary between the world and yourself is fluid, and it's sort of a give and take. And then you have the modern version of it, which is the buffered self, where you step back from the world and analyze all of it. And I think there's disadvantages to and advantages to both sort of ideas. But there is that idea where, if you're living in a rural place, the boundary between yourself and the world is very porous. You're very much in tune with the world around you. You know when something's up. And it's like if you walk in the same path, the same trail. If you go hiking a lot and you go down the same way, and you all of a sudden you hear no sounds, and something's up. It's sort of that I think it's sort of a under the surface where we find ourselves porous, but we like to kind of like put on this very thick skin so that we can step away from everything and everybody, and it's very much informed by the materialistic world around us. We are coming up on our break, and I will get to my point once we get there. I promise I'm not meandering. It's definitely worth it. But you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno and Tim Schwartz, talking with Joshua Cutchin about changelings, fairies, and folklore. And we'll be right back right after this.
Casey Kasem has unlocked the American Top 40 vaults and is replaying original shows from the 80s. This week, Casey brings us a special, part 2 of the top 100 songs of 1983. We'll hear big hits by Michael Jackson, The Police, Bonnie Tyler, Culture Club, Donna Summer, and many more. They're all right here on part 2 of the top 100 songs of 1983 on American Top 40, the 80s.
You can depend on us for public service, ON Radio.
Never get tired of that jingle. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno and our wonderful guest, Joshua Cutchin, and guest co-host, Tim Schwartz. And we're talking about fairy folk, we're talking about folklore, and we're talking about changelings, and we're discussing sort of the deeper implications of them in human society. And now I'm going to get to my point that I started to make before we got to the break, and my point is this. My wife really likes true crime, loves true crime. And she scares the crap out of herself, but she can't get enough of it, and it's so fascinating because she's like, we have to do all these things to keep people out of her house, and I'm like, Marion, we live in an incredibly safe town. It's like the statistics are very slim, despite what all the documentaries and podcasts will tell you, but it's the same fear that there's something unstoppable coming for me and my family and my property, my things, and that sort of idea that we have all of this protection but there's something on the outside of it. There's something on the outskirts of society, and typically it's where the monstrous lives, where something unexplainable can happen. And I guess there could be an element of illness, there could be an element of spiritualness to it, but I always kind of like the balanced approach of maybe it's a little bit of both. Because there's a spiritual reality to everything, whether we like to admit it or not. The problem is when you kind of go to one side or the other and you say it's all this, it's all that, because then you're not treating the whole problem. I think it's a holistic view of reality. I don't know how you feel about that.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, to your earlier point, it's almost as if all of our technological improvements have been trying to erect more and more buffers between us and reality. I've been thinking about that quite a lot lately. I think that embracing the pendulum swing one way or the other too much, you're just going to be made a fool if you're into these topics, right? If you say that it's all psychic or that it's all, imaginal, you're going to find those burn marks in the ground at the UFO site, and you're going to find that Bigfoot footprint in the ground. And I think that sometimes in my more contemplative moments, I think that might even be the purpose of this phenomena, is to sort of challenge us to reevaluate our preconceptions. But, a good example of sort of what you're getting at is I will sit here and adamantly tell you that there is no indication of fairies in any of the folklore of having wings. You just won't find it. Fairies do not have wings. They're often short, but just as often can appear the size of an average human being. Fairy wings are an addition that was added on in Shakespearean plays and children's books. But then you look at the work of someone like my friend Dr. Simon Young, who has put together this fairy census, which is an excellent resource looking at contemporary fairy encounters. And, at least in the first of the two, he just dropped a new one, but in the first of those two fairy censuses, you'll find that the accounts are replete with these little, effeminate women with wings flitting through the air. So I do think that there's an aspect of this that is sort of responding to our own cultural expectations and sort of co-creating with us in a way. Now, I made it a point to say in the first because I haven't had a chance to dig into the second lately. I'm going to do that next week. But Simon has released a second fairy census of just fairy sightings from, I believe 2017 until now. And I had heard, and again, I have not had the chance to go through this, but I had heard that the winged fairy has sort of started to taper off in terms of the number of times that it's been sighting, and some of these descriptions are hewing back to the older interpretations of these beings being a little bit more conventional in their appearance if you're looking at the older folklore, which I think probably says a lot about the direction that our culture is taking, and the sort of how interested folks have become in folk magic and the occult and whatnot. I think that might be playing a role in the way that these things manifest. But again, just because they change their appearance doesn't mean that they can't steal your shoes,
Right,
or things like that. So it really is a tightrope that you have to walk, and you have to, in that very Robert Anton Wilson way, be aware and not fall into following your own belief system too much. You have to be sort of open to a lot of different approaches.
Or just be incredibly not nuanced. It's either or.
That too.
So I guess my follow-up question to that would be, is it that the phenomena is manifesting, or is it the perspective on the phenomena that's changing?
Well, I mean, in line with what we just said, I think that your guess is as good as mine. I think that whatever this is, I think that it has been actually surprisingly consistent over the years. A lot of people hear me talk and they sort of get it backwards what I'm driving at when I draw the comparisons to the UFO stuff. They'll think that I think that today's aliens are actually fairies in disguise, or that yesterday's fairies were aliens in disguise. And that's not really the role of what true comparativism has to offer. I think what it really is just saying, look, without making a judgment call on the ontology of these things, you can say these things look similar. I do suspect that it's the same thing that we've had, and I think that it's walked with us ever since we, first made fire. I think that it's been with us all this time. And that's just my own personal assessment of it. But I do think that it's been with us, and it sort of adapts to the cultural and societal expectations. I mean, again, you look at the UFO phenomenon, which I know isn't our primary focus, but the way that these craft have sort of changed from these Art Nouveau flying saucers into these, deep state black triangles that remind the stealth bomber to in starting even further back, these steampunk airships and the airship wave of the 1900s.
Yeah, right.
And now they're these sort of like drone-like plasmoids that dart across the sky. It seems like whatever our expectations are, this thing adapts. And in the case of the UFO, just sort of adds about 20 years to what we can do, maybe adds a generation to what we can do and how it can manifest. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is in people's heads. It might be from people's heads in the sense that, we're tapping into some sort of Jungian collective unconscious or archetypes or egregores, take your pick. But I do think that whatever this is has the ability to interact with us and to sort of anticipate our expectations.
Interesting. You got anything, Tim?
Well, it is interesting that, here we are in the 21st century, and as you alluded to, there are still reports coming in of people having these fairy experiences. And a lot of these reports come from people who have, like most people, have no idea
Right.
that this is a reoccurring phenomenon to them. Fairies is something you see on Disney or in your children's books.
Yeah, it's always so funny to me when people are talking about well, Bigfoot is plausible because we know that there were large primates in the past, and it's not like we're talking about unicorns and leprechauns. And I always go, actually, maybe, and it's such a I can't even. There are very few paranormal, quote unquote, hills that I'll die upon. Psi phenomena is one of them. The near death experience is another one of them. I don't really know that this stuff has any objective reality to it, but I will say that we cannot get away from these motifs and these themes. I mean, I've had an idea. My latest book focusing on fairies is this collection of essays called Fairy Films, and it looks at a broad variety of movies and television shows that sort of incorporate fairy themes, both explicitly and implicitly. I was the editor of it, and I contributed one essay, and I have a lot of other authors who were kind enough to contribute essays to it as well. But that's just one example, how these themes sort of creep into our lives. I mean, there's another idea that I've played with for a long time. I'll probably never do it, but it's this idea of putting together a coffee table book that's just a list of these fairy words that have stuck with us all this time. I mean, the word stroke, the medical condition for a stroke, is directly derived from the idea of the fairy stroke, the idea that the fairies would come up and sort of touch you and make you seize up.
Huh. I never knew that.
It was exactly that's part of my point is we just live with this stuff. We don't really realize how much it's been of an influence. I mean, the color cobalt, that blue color cobalt, was directly derived from the kobolds, which are sort of a Tommyknocker fairy variation that lived in the mines of Germany. To this day, if you have a ring of mushrooms in your yard and, you get a lawn care bill, it might say, removal of fairy ring, and these are all things that we just sort of live with, and that they've become so incorporated into our lives. And, changelings are also one of those things as well. If you sort of look for that child swap, child abduction and child swap trope, you'll find it all over your pop culture. And again, I find it really interesting. There was a Netflix series, spoiler for a Netflix series that's several years old now, but it was a Netflix series called Katla that takes place in, I believe it was Iceland. And there are all these sort of strange doubles of people who were popping up. And the explanation was that it was a meteorite from space that was doing it. And I'm like, well, you're kind of just shifting the goals, right? Because it's like, oh, well, it's from space, so it's magic. And I'm like, but what you're doing is you're telling another of these, not a fairy tale, but another fairy story, a story that's really has these deep ties embedded into fairy folklore like we knew it. So we're going to keep reinventing the same thing, but it's always going to come back to a lot of these fairy tropes that we see.
Interesting. Well, before we burn up the hour here, Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about your books where people can find out more about you and do a little bit of shameless self-promotion?
Okay. I have an allergic reaction to that, but I'll try my best. I have trouble counting how many books I've done because I've gotten to the point where I kind of have to split them in half because they get too long. So depending on how you count, I've written 7 books. A Trojan Feast, which is about the food and drink offerings that take place in some of these encounters. The Brimstone Deceit, which is all about smells during certain paranormal encounters. Thieves in the Night, which we've talked about today. My 2-parter with my co-author Timothy Renner called Where the Footprints End, which is all about high strangeness and Bigfoot reports. The Fairy Films essay collection that I mentioned. My latest nonfiction book is the 2-parter Ecology of Souls, a New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal, and that talks about how a lot of these different contact modalities, these different phenomena, all seem to tie into a narrative that centers around our final transition in a lot of ways. pertinent to today's conversation, there are a lot of cultures that prior to the rise of theosophy in the 19th century would have thought of fairies not as nature elementals, but as the human dead. So there are a lot of connections that you can draw to these different things. So that's my latest nonfiction. And then in August of last year, I had the very foolish idea of writing a novel called Them Old Ways Never Died. It was I had numerous factors that made me decide to do that. Not the least of which was the fact that I didn't really have the appetite for writing another nonfiction book at the time. But it was sort of a challenge to myself to see if I could do it. And if you've been paying attention to today's interview, you probably have a good idea of who the antagonists in that particular novel are. But then I'm pleased to announce this. I believe this is the first time that I've announced it on an interview or a radio or a podcast. This spring, I'll be teaching a course on near-death experiences through the Cosmos Institute. That's KOSMOS Institute.org. It begins on March 23rd. It is a 9-class course on near-death experiences. And we're going to go through some of the more and less common aspects of near-death experiences before transitioning in the latter half of the class to look at some of the ways that the near-death experience seems reflected in things like other altered states of consciousness, fairy encounters, shamanic initiations in various worldwide cultures, and the close encounter experience. So I'm really excited about that. And anybody who's interested, again, can go to cosmosinstitute.org. That's Cosmos with a K. I'm not sure when enrollment ends, but I do know that the first class will be in late March. So sooner rather than later, if anyone's interested in that. It's part of a series of courses that will conclude with a course taught by Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. So it's a real honor to be included in that. Yeah.
We do like Dr. Jeffrey. He's a really good guy. I enjoyed having him on the show. Tim, do you have anything else? Because I want to launch into something and I don't want to step on you.
Well, I just wanted to comment real quick, talking about the whole death and dying motif. I just saw somebody talking about a death experience that he had, where he said that he ended up in what appeared to be almost like a hospital or a clinic-like situation, and that around his bed were these little blue guys that he said sounded that looked an awful lot like the Whitley Strieber's blue guys from Communion. Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned earlier Coble, so it's just like, once again, here we have this interesting intertwining of these different types of mythos, phenomena, however you want to put it.
Yeah, everything seems to touch everything else in this particular field, and that's part of the reason that I found it kind of frustrating that the ghost people have stayed away from the UFO people, and the UFO people have stayed away from the Bigfoot people, because there seems to be some sort of connective tissue there. If not the same phenomenon wearing different masks, then at least this thing seems to manifest in similar ways or use similar vectors to communicate. But there does seem to be some sort of connection between all these things. And when you do an interview, it kind of makes you sound like a crazy person, because you feel like you have to talk about all these different things to bring together a cohesive narrative. So that's where we are, I guess.
Well, context is everything. It is incredibly important. It's if you've ever read anything by Dostoevsky, it's like 90% of it is like context, but it's all important stuff, because it's good to know the story behind things, because then you can understand it. My dad always used to say you have to know where you came from to know where you're going, and so I think apt. But that is my theory. I've had this theory. I wrote it in an essay that I never finished. It's somewhere on my hard drive, and one day I will finish it. That my theory is that the paranormal is the mythology of the modern world. And yes. My theory for this is because we have all these unexplained things, and we're trying so hard to fit it into these boxes. And we're like, okay, Bigfoot's way over there, ghosts are over there, and it's like, the ghost people will be like, well, Bigfoot's not real, ghost, he's obviously he's obviously a ghost, but ghosts of dead people, that's a thing. And then you have the Bigfoot people saying the same thing about ghosts, and ufologists keeping an arm's length away from all of it because they want scientific credit. And so it's a whole thing, but it's all part of this same sort of like web that we've been a part of forever. All of these things are in every different culture, and they're given different names. Bigfoot's called Hanuman in India, in Hinduism, or Yeti or whatever, or if you even want to go way further back, you can call him Enkidu if you'd like. It's one of those things where these things have been present, and it's so hard to nuance it and not sound like an idiot, because it's just so unnuanced. It's just a phenomena that's just constantly present, and we're trying our best to define it from all of our different cultural perspectives. But there's obviously an objective reality, but we're all experiencing that objective reality subjectively.
And their story, the different sort of types of phenomena that you mentioned, their story really is our story, and that's something I think it's really important to understand. Is that the diversity of this phenomenon? It's a lot like humanity, right? It manifests in diverse ways, but underneath it, there is this similar theme that you can find globally in all these different contexts, much like human beings. So, I think that. I don't want to go too far into where we're too far past our time here, but there's a wonderful quote from Ami Michel that he told Jacques Vallée, which is, he said, looking at UFOs is a curious business because you start with field work and you end up looking at the work of Arab mystics. And I really think that's a great quote that sort of gets at how looking into these phenomena can be sort of a form of personal alchemy and improvement and finding interest in places that you normally wouldn't. And sometimes at the end of the day, even if none of this stuff has any objective reality, I think it's made me a better rounded person.
I mean, hey, that's a positive outlook on it. Some people just get really entrenched in what they're into. So I mean, I guess it's kind of like 6 and 1/2 dozen in the other, in some sense of the word. But no, I tend to agree, because it's I want to take a quick half step back. You mentioned food and drink offerings, and I had to say something about it. I was listening to a lecture a while ago with a biblical scholar, and someone was asking a question like, well, why would you like burn stuff? And he was like, well, how do you think they're supposed to eat it?
Right.
And he was talking about like someone was like, oh yeah, well, people in Athens, they'd bring the food and stuff to like the idols, and then they'd have like the little thing of oil. And he's like, but I just never understood what the oil was for. And he was like, well, that's what burned the cake.
Right.
And it was like, and it was interesting because I thought about that, because we still do a lot of stuff with smell, and it's like the sense of smell is really big in folklore. I mean, you have sage, you have incense, you have all of these different things, and it's all part of the senses in which we interact with this sort of other layer of reality, if you will, that's going on at the same time. And it's just, I don't know, it's just interesting stuff. I just wanted to put that out there because it is important, because the senses are important.
Yeah, and there's an entire, believe it or not, field of olfactory philosophy that talks at length about the fact that we tend to trust our noses even more than we trust our eyes and our ears, because there's, this doesn't pass the smell test. Something doesn't smell right. A rose by any other name. These ideas sort of imply that our noses can cut to the chase and determine the true nature of something. And it makes sense if you're dealing with something that's as ephemeral as this phenomenon seems to be, that there's something, well, essential in the essential oil sense, about something like smell. Yeah, it makes it renders the intangible tangible. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I guess one thing we're kind of coming down to the wire here, but I guess we can end on a fun little note. So, Josh, where do you feel? I guess you're sort of an paranormal, investigator in this sense. Where do you see the field heading in the next few years?
It depends on if we're around as a species in the next few years.
It's a good caveat.
I actually am finding myself more bullish on the current UFO disclosure season, which is a phrase that I never thought would come out of my mouth. But I do think that some interesting developments have been made recently, and I have also been I've been approaching the topic with a new awareness as to the fact that a lot of the people who are involved in the disclosure movement seem to be fully aware of and in acknowledgement of some of the high strangeness and some of the stranger aspects of the phenomenon. I think that even amongst people who would still adhere to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, there's an acknowledgement that this has something to do with consciousness as well and the fundamental nature of reality, which has been a big reason why I've always had so much hesitancy towards sort of endorsing the disclosure movement, is because I saw those as being a secondary concern to proving that we're being visited by little green scientists. So I think that something interesting is going to happen in that regard. What I would where I'm sort of anticipating that we land is if you look at something like the Kennedy assassination, 15, 20 years ago, if you talk to a person on the street, there was kind of a 50-50 chance that they might think that there was something strange going on with the Kennedy assassination. Nowadays, it's like, 2080. So most people are saying there is some we're not being told something, right? That's sort of where the general consensus of the population has landed, at least in my experience. And I think that might be where we land with the UFO question in the next couple of years. Not that we know that they're from Zebel Ganubi or Zeta Reticuli, but rather that there does seem to be something genuinely anomalous that we don't have the full story of. And while that is a far cry from what we've been promised in terms of disclosure, it's also a marked sea change in terms of the way that the public looks at the phenomenon. So that's sort of my prediction. Predictions tend to age like milk, but that's my prediction for where these fields go. I do continue to see some really exciting scholarship in terms of bringing these different topics together and a lot of cross-pollination. The same cross-pollination that you mentioned so many communities were sort of hesitant to engage in, and I think that's really exciting as well. So that's where I think we will wind up if we don't get too preoccupied with, just trying to stay alive in the next few years.
Yeah, right. That's in some cases, it's a very important thing to be preoccupied by.
It's true. That's true.
And I guess on that note, Josh, thank you for being with us. And now I have the unfortunate pleasure of doing our one final announcement today, which is only one, and it is a very sad one. This is our final broadcast for those who did not know. One factor in my dad's complex illness is that he can't always speak, and never very clearly, unfortunately. We've always been a father and son team, and so after 15 and a half years on the air and some 1,200 broadcasts, we feel that we cannot carry on without the two of us fully functioning, unfortunately. But our website, BehindTheParanormal.com, will remain available for free access to all of our recorded shows. So if you do want to listen to those 1,200 shows, they are all there and also on your favorite podcast platforms. Those will all be available as well. So from the bottom of our hearts, we thank the hundreds of people who have supported us and encouraged us along the way. The folks at Achieve Radio in South Dakota, where we initially got our start. Man, that was a long time ago. Jeez, that was like 13. And that was back. Oh no, I was 15. That was 2008. The team at CBS Radio from 2009 to 2014, and most of all here at WOON AM and FM Radio for nearly our entire time on the air. I think it was from 2009 on, if I'm not mistaken. Our great show here includes our wonderful benevolent station manager and executive producer Dave Richards, tech producer Craig Pelletier, casting producer Lori Greer, and research assistant Andrew Veranis, and as well as me on the board here every week. They got us through regular shows, as well as the countless hair-raising and on-location broadcasts, and that is why I have no hair today. Guest co-hosts have kept us going over the years, too, especially lately, so many thanks to you, Tim Schwartz, for being on with us today. Shane Searway, Lori Greer, Matt Moniz, Bill Burns, Rick Eno, Mark D'Antonio, Valerie LaFaso, Kathleen Martin, Peter William Shelley, and even Nick Pope, if you're listening. That one time you sat in for my dad and co-hosted a show with me. And how many people can say that? And we remember our late co-hosts, Rosemary Ellen Guiley and Tim Beckley. So many thanks to our hundreds of guests and millions of listeners in over 65 countries over the years. It's been a wild ride. Can't say we didn't discuss a lot, it's not like we didn't go out on a high note, I'd like to think anyway. And who knows, we'll see what the future holds.
Well, I just want to thank both Paul and Ben for 15 and a half years of excellent shows, wonderful guests on subjects that fascinate us all. And I tell you, I'm honored that they have allowed me to be a part of Behind the Paranormal. So thank both of you.
All I can say is thank you and keep watching the skies.
Well, we'll leave you here today with a thought from Katrina Mayer. Beginnings and endings are exactly the same. It just depends on which side of the door you choose to be on. I'm Tim Swartz.
I'm Paul Eno.
I'm Ben Eno, and considering we have about a minute left, I do have one final comment to say besides the prepared statement that I read off of. Because boy, oh boy, how can you fit 15 and a half years into 5 minutes? You can't. And we've had the pleasure of talking to greats all over the field. We've had, you never know how much your words affect somebody. And I always find it strange when people say it's an honor to be on our show because, the other 90% of the week I'm behind a desk, ordering materials and trying to buy trucks and deal with the RMV. It's very strange when people say that, but it has been an incredible honor and an amazing experience to do this with my dad. And it's been, it's been one of the best things that's ever happened to me. And thank you, Dad, for being a part of this with me, and thank you, everybody, for being a part of this journey with us. And you know what? Thank you for joining us on our great cosmic journey. This is Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.